Hello there, welcome to Roundtable. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Now, rich nations vaccinate one person against COVID-19 every second, while poorer nations don't have enough vaccines. Just 2% of Africans have had one dose. Europe and the US have promised to donate more doses, but are they doing enough? Former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown has urged British, Italian and US leaders to hold an emergency summit to end vaccine inequality. He calls it neo-colonialism. But will Western leaders respond to the criticism? 100 countries are backing a proposal to waive patents for COVID-19 vaccines. The idea is that low-income countries which aren't getting enough doses could manufacture their own. But several nations, including the UK and Germany, are against it. EU member states have pledged to share 160 million COVID-19 vaccines globally. The UK announced recently it will deliver 9 million doses. Germany has pledged to donate at least 30 million vaccines, while France is set to donate 5% of its vaccines to poorer countries. But charities Oxfam and Global Justice Now argue these countries don't give enough vaccines to developing nations. And rich countries, including the UK and Germany, are blocking a proposal led by South Africa and India to temporarily waive intellectual property protection on COVID-19 technologies. This proposal would allow poorer nations to create COVID-19 vaccines of their own. 50 of the least wealthy nations, home to 20% of the world's population, have received just 2% of all doses. So, how can low-income nations get access to more COVID-19 vaccines? So let me introduce today's guests on Roundtable. In Geneva, Greg Perry, the Assistant Director General of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. In Oxford, here in the UK, Mohga Kamal Yanni, Senior Health Policy Advisor at the People Vaccine Alliance. And in London, Luke McDonagh, Assistant Professor of Law at the London School of Economics. Good to have all of you with us. Thanks for joining us. Mohga, let me start with you. The proposal to waive intellectual property rules for COVID vaccines, how important would that be for poorer countries to be able to manufacture their own vaccines?
It is important in terms of removing one big barrier against the production of not just vaccines, by the way. It's vaccines. It's against all the tools that are related, that are relevant to COVID. So medicines, tests, any other tools that are important for COVID. So the intellectual property rights are a big barrier for companies. So no company can actually use any of the technology that's available for any of these tools to produce the equivalent version in their country.
Yes, but that's the case for all patented medicines. So why should we make an exception for COVID-19 vaccines?
Well, why do we make an exception for a pandemic that's devastating the whole world? You know, if we don't make an exception when it is a pandemic, when it is an emergency, when the global economy slowing down massively, when livelihood of millions of people is destroyed, when millions of people are suffering from, the disease and from lack of oxygen, when health systems are in many countries and are on their knees. I mean, when would you make an exception? That COVID-19 is an exception in its own, in causing all that global devastation, and therefore it needs global action. Emergency actions that on a massive scale that were not done before, or that they should be done now.
Okay, so obviously we're living in extraordinary times. Luke,
yeah.
What is the main argument being made by countries opposed to lifting IP rules? I mean, these countries include the UK, Germany, Switzerland, Japan.
Well, at the moment, countries like Germany and the UK, Switzerland, Japan are making two arguments. One is that the intellectual property waiver at the WTO will not do anything to improve the speed at which vaccines can be manufactured and produced and distributed to countries such as South Africa and India. And there's over 100 countries now at the WTO that support this, most of which are in the developing world. And so their argument is that this won't actually help that much. And then their second argument is somewhat contradictory to that first one, because they argue that to have a waiver would cause so much damage that it would destroy the incentives to create new medicines. And as far as I'm concerned, as an intellectual property lawyer, I'm very skeptical of both of these arguments. For the first argument, there are companies in the developing world, like Incepta in Bangladesh. There's companies in South Africa like Aspen and Biovet that are already getting engaged in the production of vaccines. There's companies as well in the developed world. In Canada, a company called BioLice, a company called Bavarian Nordic in Denmark. All of these companies have sought licenses to produce vaccines. A massive generics company, Teva, has also offered capacity and has been rebuffed. So rather than it being a case of all hands on deck, what we're seeing is a case of artificial scarcity, in which the control of vaccine production is in the hands of a small number of companies whom are based in Europe and North America.
But a small number of companies who put a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of know-how, took the risks in the first place and have produced the vaccines which could end this pandemic.
Well, I think this relates to, that's a very important question that relates to that second question about incentives, the second point they make. It's very important to emphasize here that the risk associated with the vaccine production here has been a shared risk, and an enormous amount of public funding has gone into these vaccines. No. In the case of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the vast majority of the funds for the development of that vaccine came from the public. And the manufacturing costs of AstraZeneca have largely been de-risked by UK government funds, pre-purchase agreements with the EU and other countries, including the US.
All right, let's get the view from the industry then. Greg, where do pharma companies stand on this issue about relaxing the IP rules so that low-income countries can manufacture their own vaccines?
Let me first just indicate that from the beginning of the pandemic, the industry was committed to equitable and remains committed to equitable and fair access, to global solidarity and to partnership. And from the beginning had indicated this was not business as usual. Certainly share the viewpoint of all the panelists and many of the audience that we are in a pandemic. It's a tragic pandemic, and it's something that I think all stakeholders, including industry, have wanted to put every single possible effort into. But the issue around the intellectual property is essentially that this is not where the challenge or the problem lies. The issue has been about ensuring massive manufacturing from basically zero at the beginning of the year to what we've reached is 5 billion at the moment. And we've done that, it is true, and we're proud of that, in partnership and in solidarity with other groups, including governments, to achieve those objectives. And I think the issue now is we're at 5 billion, we're very likely to get at 11 billion at the end of the year. So the actual global targets are being met. Now, those have been met, as I said, through partnership. And there's been unprecedented voluntary licensing agreements and partnerships. Some 300 partnerships have been developed. And some over 200 of those are voluntary licensing arrangements with very significantly tech transfer, including and significantly to companies in developing countries. The most obvious one being the Serum Institute in India, which has been a principal vaccine source. And we can come to problems that
the Serum Institute in India, which then stopped exporting COVID-19 vaccines, which has contributed to the shortage.
Yeah, this has been a result, of course, of the tragic unfolding of the COVID situation in India. which had this not taken place, that would have ensured that the Serum Institute would have been able to have supplied kovacs with a targeted number of vaccines that would have ended up for other developing countries. And now we are having to deal with that situation.
Well, I mean, we're going to talk about kovacs in a minute, because kovacs is obviously, there are problems with vaccine sharing. But just on this issue of low-income countries being able to manufacture their own vaccines, why is that being opposed by so many companies and Western countries? Is this about profit? Is it because Pfizer's making billions in selling its vaccines?
No, it's not about profit. It's about being able to achieve the end goal, which is ensuring that we work with trusted and appropriate companies that are able to absorb technology transfer and that have the capacity and the history of being able to produce these products. We're in a pandemic. We need to work very quickly. And one thing I do want to emphasize is that the tech transfer, the ability to tech transfer, is a two-way thing. We need the tech transfer from the innovative company, which has their trainers and their skilled staff, and the absorption of those on the other side. And this is why we have a large number of partnerships, but this is why we need to work with a certain group of companies to ensure that we can get the vaccines out efficiently and safely to as many people.
Mohga, this idea of tech transfer, okay, Greg makes the salient point that manufacturing is a complex process. We need to make sure that the vaccines being produced are safe and are of quality. What do you say to Greg's points?
So first, all these big figures about, how many contract transfers that the companies signed or the companies made these contracts, how many of them are actually in developing countries and how many are beyond AstraZeneca? So, on one side, they say, oh, we have to ensure that these companies in developing countries can produce. On the other hand, there are some contracts with companies that can produce. So do developing countries have companies that can produce, or they don't have companies that can produce? So AstraZeneca has agreements with Serum Institute, with Brazil, a company in Brazil, and in South Korea, and something in Argentina as well. But there are other companies that are waiting to have this technology. Are you saying that in developing countries, we don't have the intellectual capacity to actually absorb the technology and understand the technology?
Well, I don't think he's saying it's about intellectual capacity. What you're saying, Greg, is that the technology has to be in place for vaccines to be manufactured safely. However, I guess the question is, why can't the industry help low-income countries do that?
Well, we're already doing that. I mean, there was the technology transfer that was given to the Serum Institute and to a number of other companies, which was mentioned in different countries, Brazil, for example. And this was done with Aspen in South Africa. And most recently, an agreement struck between BioNTech, Pfizer, and BioVac. So it is happening, and we would like to see more of that. But even
Greg,
as the African Union has
Greg.
indicated.
Let's just move the discussion on, because, I mean, the only reason a patent waiver is being discussed in the first place is because poorer countries are simply not getting the vaccines they were promised. If you look at the graph of vaccination rates by continent, you can see North America has vaccinated nearly half its population, Europe almost the same. Across Africa, just 2.2% of the population is vaccinated. Luke, if we talk about the WHO's sharing mechanism, COVAX, it really hasn't worked the way it was supposed to, has it?
Well, the numbers tell the story. At the beginning of the year, COVAX said that it would be able to deliver 2 billion doses during 2021, largely to developing countries. At the moment, COVAX has just passed the milestone of delivering 200 million, and we're almost 9 months through the year. So, unless 1.8 billion doses are going to be delivered in the next 3 months, which is practically an impossibility, Kovacs is going to miss its targets by a considerable
So what's
amount.
the issue? Is it a distribution problem, a rich country stockpiling? What?
It's both. As countries like Israel and now the United States announcing today that it will have booster doses, third doses for all of its adult citizens, the doses that are being produced are going to the richer countries. And Pfizer, for example, which is supplying a huge amount of doses to the richer countries, has already made more than 30 billion in revenue this year from these vaccines. So we have an unequal distribution problem, but it is related to the production problem because there aren't enough doses being produced to cover all the adults, given that we now have this issue that boosters will be due soon in developed countries. And we also have this issue of security of supply. I mean, the Serum Institute has been doing great work in India, but it really is the only success story of tech transfer of a company in the developing world that is producing large volume of doses by itself and is not just doing, let's say, fill and finish, which is what some of the South African companies are doing. And that provides India with security of supply. But when India stopped exporting, suddenly COVAX in the developing world lost their security of supply. And that cannot stand. We need countries like South Africa. We need regional hubs around other parts of Asia, including Southeast Asia, to be able to rely on their own supply. If we continue to rely on production that is controlled by global north companies like Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and so on, then that they will obviously supply their own populations first, the US, Canada, and Europe. And we know that there's hoarding of vaccine doses. We know that millions of doses have expired in the United States because that they expected a larger take-up of vaccines. There's been a lot of vaccine hesitancy. So we've got hoarding of vaccines on top of production problems. CureVac will not produce any usable doses this year. Johnson & Johnson has missed target after target. AstraZeneca has missed target after target. So whether we get to 11 billion doses by the end of this year is still an open question.
Mohga, I saw you nodding during Luke's answer there. Clearly, COVAX is not, even though nations like the UK and the US have recently reiterated promises to give more vaccines, is COVAX failing in its job to get vaccines to poorer countries?
Well, COVAX was set up with, in its DNA, inequality. In DNA, it had the factor that would make it fail. So last year, from April last year, we knew there was possibility, last year, 2020, there was a possibility that we would have a vaccine. And therefore, you knew that in order to, you don't need to be even a specialist to realize that in order to control the virus, you need to vaccinate at least 60% of the population. As WHO said, 70% of the global population. So you can, on the back of the envelope, calculate how many billions of doses you need for that. To vaccinate these people. And therefore, how do you maximize production? And instead of maximizing production, therefore, you have doses for everybody using all the capacity in the world. Instead of doing that, rich countries, global leaders, actually including COVAX, by the way, they were very happy to leave 3 fundamental decisions at the time of this global emergency in the hands of pharmaceutical companies. So the first one is how many doses to produce. That's depending on the company capacity. Where do you allocate it? So the companies went to the rich countries that already paid millions and millions of dollars. We talk about $100 billion being paid for the production or the research and production of these vaccines. And then the price. And therefore, you see, Pfizer, you mentioned the booster in Europe and in the UK. Pfizer increased the price, and they talk about increasing the price next year. So 3 fundamental decisions in the hands of pharmaceutical companies at the time of emergency. So COVAX didn't look at this issue at all. So that's a start. Second thing about COVAX in the inequality issue, they said they will give the vaccines to countries up until they vaccinate 20% of their population, but they gave rich countries up to 50% of the population. Is that equality? And then the other thing is they refused to do anything that would increase the number of doses needed.
A lot of your points have been reiterated by the former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who was angry over the fact that Johnson & Johnson vaccines were produced at a factory in South Africa, but then exported to the EU instead of helping African countries. In an article, he said, vaccine nationalism and Europe's neo-colonial approach to global health is dividing the world into rich and protected people who live and those who are poor, unprotected and at risk of dying. So, Greg, obviously there's a lot of points to answer there. But first of all, this accusation that there is this vaccine inequality because there is this neo-colonial approach, as Gordon Brown calls it, to global health, and pharma companies are part of that. What do you say to that?
Well, first, I did read the article by Gordon Brown in The Guardian, and to be honest, there's a large amount of it I think personally many people in the industry would even agree to, because whatever terminology is being used, he has pointed, as many have, including ourselves, about there is a vaccine inequality in the distribution and supply of the vaccines. And, you know, we are party to that argument of saying that there must be vaccine redistribution. So we are fully behind that, and our companies have pushed for that, are in discussion with governments about redirecting dosages and in re-establishing contractual agreements and working within kovacs to achieve that as well. But if I may, there were a lot of issues that have come up. Maybe I'll try and answer all of them.
Well, let's just what are the most important ones? That pharma companies are simply not producing enough doses to meet demand. What's the answer to that?
Okay. That one I seriously do dispute, because, as I said, we're at the 5 billion mark. We'll reach the 11 billion mark, and we'll have much more in 2022. The issue about production has been issues around supply issues, raw material issues, injection packs. These sort of issues have caused a slower, probably, scale up that we wanted. It's not to do with the number of manufacturers, it's to do with the scale in which the manufacturers can work out. There's no point having a whole series of smaller manufacturers dealing with vaccines when we need to have manufacturing at very, very large amounts and 24/7. And that's why certain companies, even within our own association, had offered to do production, but their production capacity was too small. We have limited amount of raw materials, and we have limited amount of specialists in tech transfer. So we need to focus that. So I don't think that's the real problem. So I think the problem is supply. What's the real problem? I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah, I think where we're facing now the issue is about supply. And this industry and the companies did not produce these products just for developed or rich vaccine countries. This was part of a global effort that's been made from the beginning. What we need to do now is work with these countries which have, reached their targets to now redistribute their dosages. Some which were manufactured and some which are in the pipeline, and that is fundamental. I mean, they hedged their bets, but they mustn't hoard. Not now. It's
Luke, are you reassured by that? Because in the whole argument, it often seems whenever we talk about global trade that low-income countries always seem to have lower priority. So are you optimistic that future pledges going forward is going to actually redress the inequality?
Well, one thing that does give me some hope, and I think that I would certainly advocate for more voluntary licensing, and I think that the waiver proposal made by India and South Africa has been very, very useful in this regard, because it has put a lot of pressure on pharmaceutical companies. And, for example, I don't think that we would have seen the agreement between BioNTech and BioVac that was agreed only in late June, early July, were it not for the waiver proposal and the media attention that has focused on this issue of vaccine equity. And that was a very positive step, because it's the first time that South Africa or any developing country will be playing such a large role in the production of an mRNA vaccine. And it's worth pointing out as well with the mRNA vaccines that This capacity did not exist a year ago and has been built at great speed, often in places that weren't necessarily purposed for this kind of vaccine production in the past. So it is true that some of the facilities in the developing world may not yet be at the standard that is expected, but some of them are already involved. And other capacity can be built more quickly. And so the waiver has been very important at putting pressure on to get more voluntary deals. But the argument is that it still doesn't go far enough. What we want to see in South Africa is full production of mRNA vaccines, not just fill and finish, whereby it's produced in Europe and transferred in bulk to South Africa and then finished into final vials. We want that technology transfer to happen.
Okay, guys, we're going to have to leave it there because we have amazingly run out of time, and it has been a really, really interesting discussion. I want to thank all of my guests, Greg and Mohga and Luke. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this edition of Roundtable. And you can see more of our debates on our YouTube channel. For now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye.